As was mentioned in the introduction, spent the first 18 years of my life in Senegal, West Africa, which is a Muslim country. It's about 98% Muslim. Then we lived in Tunisia for a number of years, which is in North Africa, and then in Cairo, Egypt for about 10 years. And I've worked throughout the Islamic world, from Mauritania and West Africa all the way through to Malaysia. And I've spent probably all but maybe 13, 14 years now of my life in a Muslim majority context. And the only people I know who, without even thinking twice, would step in front of a car for me, in other words, give their life for me, are my Muslim brothers and sisters, friends. So the loyalty and the relationship is that deep. Therefore, I have a great respect, of course, for Islam as a religion and a profound love for my Muslim brothers and sisters who number among my closest friends. I'm also passionate about the teachings of Jesus, or of Isa, the Quranic term for Jesus. However, I should point out not always the Jesus of Christianity or the Jesus of the church, and I'll explain a little bit about that later on. But as my Muslim friends, in truly loving me, wish me to follow the revelation that the Prophet Muhammad received, I also desire for them to experience what I have experienced of Jesus and benefit from his teachings and his character, but without all of the sociological and cultural and religious and political and historical barriers that exist, and my, do they exist. Both faiths, when they're faithful at core, are missional in orientation. I remember when the Archbishop of Canterbury, the former two-back Lord Carey, came to Cairo for a large interfaith dialogue meeting at Al-Azhar, the intellectual and the spiritual heart of Sunni Islam, which are the majority of Muslims around the world. And there he was at the big table in the front, and so you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury and you've got the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, and they're going back and forth talking, and then all of a sudden there was this awkward moment of silence. You could hear a pin drop, because it each dawned on one to the other that they each wished the other to convert. That the Archbishop of Canterbury, it was clear, wanted the Grand Imam to become a Christian. And the Grand Imam, Sheikh Tantawi at that time, wanted Lord Carey to become a Muslim. It'd be incredible for the British tabloids. They'd go crazy, wouldn't they? And after this awkward moment of silence, they both beautifully broke out in this hysterical laughter, because it's fantasy. Of course, it would never happen. All of this led me on a lifelong journey, which started very early for me as a child, growing up in Senegal as a Christian minority within a Muslim majority context. Obviously, naturally, my best friends were Muslim. But as a young teenager, I would often see, especially among the adults, not usually among the children, the all too often tension and distrust that began to be developed and existed between the two. Additionally, I remember in Senegal many missionaries there that were focused on actually introducing the Senegalese, who are Muslim, to Christianity. So if you want to put it another way, they were there to convert my best friends. And sometimes it would actually happen. But then they'd be ostracized from their family and community, that no opportunities for work would exist, and some of them were brilliant. Opportunities of education or higher education, such as going to university, gone. Psychologically, they'd go through a period of great confusion, having no respectable identity per se in that culture. And to say it colloquially, they ended up getting Jesus in the Christian way, yes, but the rest of their life was hell. And I'd watched this as a young man. And I remember thinking, something's wrong here. Shouldn't be this way. Hence, it became a personal passion of mine as to what it means to relate to the other in a way that God intended for all of us. And as a Christian, put differently, what does it mean to relate to our Muslim brothers and sisters in the spirit of Christ? How does the Christian faith walk the Muslim road? Of course, there are many barriers to overcoming all of the distance actually between the two, but in my experience, they are almost always cultural or historical or economical or sociological, as opposed to belief-based or theological, which so many people first think that they are. Obviously, with all that's happening in our world, has happened and is happening in our world, perhaps now more than ever, the building of bridges between Christianity or Christians and Muslims has become all the more important. And it would be so helpful if we kind of had a guide or a guidebook to help us on this journey of building bridges. And as the side, I think, that suffers the most in terms of erroneous stereotypes is that of our Muslim brothers and sisters, I think it's very apropos to look to their tradition to guide us as a way of honoring them. Now, we're all aware, of course, and you don't have to be a scholar, but most of you are probably aware in Islam that the world over, it's known for its 5 pillars. The practices of faith, shahada, or the creed, the prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage. Tonight, this evening, I'd like to add a 6th practice for our conversation today, a word that has been greatly misunderstood, of course, over the years, especially since 9/11, and that is the whole concept of jihad. And in effect, I would propose that the challenge put before us today, by the context of the world we live in, certainly also by the teachings and the spirit of Jesus, who we Christians say we supposedly follow, and is to, in effect, return to our Muslim brothers and sisters these 6 demonstrations of their faith, but albeit perhaps in a different manner. Because I believe actually they provide for this wonderful guide that's to approaching Islam and to our Muslim brothers and sisters that's relevant, that's effective, and certainly that's authentic to the spirit and the teachings of Jesus or of Isa. 6 pillars build the bridge. First, the concept of jihad, which is too often associated, of course, in Western eyes with great tragedy, suicide bombers, Islamic extremists, fundamentalists, or the Islamic conquest of the 7th and the 8th centuries, and the list goes on and on and on, of course. Of course, in the Quran, jihad primarily means an internal striving, connoting a spiritual struggle, a wrestling, yes, toward the way, the intention, the desire of God in one's life. It's a beautiful concept and word. Some Christian traditions would call it almost spiritual warfare, as we wrestle with how we're supposed to live our lives, really according to the way Jesus taught us to live. And in light of all of this, I would say that as Christians in the West, or those who call themselves Christians at least, at this time we also need to be in a kind of struggle, or in a kind of jihad, but of a different sort in regard to Islam. And I think it can best be described that we need to proactively, and I put the emphasis on proactive, we need to proactively wage peace on the other, on our Muslim brothers and sisters. Now you could say, I'm already there, but I'm talking about action. We all know there's this continuing and even growing discord between Christians and Muslims, with an all too often Islamophobia existing. I mean, in the media, I think someone in the question today in the forum after the second service was saying, we were highlighting, rarely in the Western media is there this positive, really positive portrayal of a Muslim. And I believe we need to be involved now more than ever in an all-out effort to help them, not conquer them, with goodwill and appreciation and love and sympathy and empathy and prayer. If you're in a Christian tradition, when is the last time in your church, whether it's here at St. Matthew's or somewhere else, that you've added them to the prayers of the people? Because they're going through a lot of challenges. And for those of Christian background, this means, I think, more than ever, that we need to demonstrate the teachings of Jesus, letting our Muslim brothers and sisters see this Jesus that we follow, as opposed to primarily talking about our faith, which so much of interfaith dialogue is about. The impartation of knowledge one to the other. During this personal pilgrimage of mine, I was profoundly influenced by a book. I got stuck in India. I had 3 days in India, and I went to one of the libraries of a seminary there, and the book is titled, it's by E. Stanley Jones, it's The Christ of the Indian Road. And he talks about how Christ walks the Indian road, and he describes the role of Mahatma Gandhi in all of this. And as you may know, Gandhi was captivated by the person and the teachings of Christ and profoundly influenced by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And as a result, he was known because of that to be a defender of the Muslims in India, the minority. And that's why he was assassinated by a Hindu militant. Western Christians in India would sit at Gandhi's feet to learn and listen from him what it meant to live like Jesus in an Indian context. And I love that scene where Western Christians, they ask Gandhi, how can we more effectively communicate this Jesus that we follow in an Indian context? And Gandhi, without even thinking twice, responds, well, first of all, I would suggest that all of you Christians begin to live more like Jesus Christ. Great response. And in many ways, you've got to follow this. The Hindu Gandhi, a non-Christian, helped to Christianize unchristian Christianity. Did you follow that? And a whole non-organized Christ following arose in India, apart from the church, apart from Christianity, because he helped Indians visualize how Jesus walks the Indian road. And I'm reminded of the counsel Gandhi gave to Western Christians in India about their faith. He said, don't talk about it. The rose doesn't have to propagate its perfume. It just gives it forth, and people are drawn to it. Live it, and people will come to see the source of your power. I love the experience of St. Francis of Assisi in 1219 when he came to Egypt to meet with the Sultan Kamal, the nephew of the great Islamic military leader Salahuddin. And of course, Francis comes during the height of the Crusades. And so the Crusades are going on one or various fronts, and he comes on another front, and the Sultan receives him wondrously, opened his arms. The Sultan had never met a Christian, Western Christian, like this before. He was taken with Francis. They stayed several days together. As Francis left, he invited Francis to send all of his missionaries, the little brothers, throughout his territory. Can you imagine? During the Crusades. And Francis goes back to Italy and supposedly writes that line that we use all the time, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. Comes out of an Islamic context. Historically, Christianity has more often than not taken an argumentative or confrontational or even an apologetic approach to Islam, trying to show even at times that their faith is a better faith. But from a faith perspective, I don't think it's representative of all of the way of Jesus. Instead, I think we should model how Jesus related to the Samaritans of his day. You might call them the Muslims of Jesus' day. The Samaritans had the same religious story as the Jews, the same prophets, the same holy places, but they had differing interpretations. And yet Jesus refused to wage any tension on them whatsoever. Instead, he always, when he talks about them, makes them the heroes of his stories. And you remember Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. It leaves us one of the most beautiful stories of grace and love found in the Gospels. A well-known Muslim Arab writer that I know has this beautiful way of describing that encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman as two thirsty people that day at a sacred well who met and then journey together. In other words, they both needed each other in differing ways, and they gave to each other. Secondly, the creed, the shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammadur Rasul Allah, there is no God but God, but Muhammad, and Muhammad is God's messenger or God's prophet. Say that in front of an imam in great sincerity. That's what it takes, and that's what it requires for conversion to Islam. And it's the essence of Islamic belief. Everything flows from that. And within the theme of belief, I think we need to primarily have as our focus, quite simply, building on all the commonalities that exist between Christians and Muslims. The way I like to think of it is this way. What's the Islamic symbol of faith, in effect, albeit a popular Islamic symbol of faith? The crescent. So the crescent is that which we can see of the moon because of the illumination, but when you can see a crescent, the majority of the moon is dark. And for the sake of an illustration, I would say that what we have in what we have different with our Muslim brothers and sisters is this little sliver here, the crescent. But what we have in common is all this on the dark side of the moon. And the challenge for us more than ever is to build our relationships with the other on the dark side of the moon, a la Pink Floyd. You remember that? Because we're often constantly blinded by the illumination of our differences that we don't see everything that we have in common. And from a faith perspective, I think this means a number of things. In the midst of this increasing chasm of discord and misunderstanding, I think it calls for our day to have a whole new kind of movement. Not of belief, certainly not of religious unity, but very simply one of building on what we hold in common. Building on all the commonalities and similarities, from the traditions, the liturgical postures, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to so much of the theology. Yes, monotheism, yes, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Ishmael, etc., but also the Creator God as we see God. The authority and the respect that they place in Moses and all the Hebrew prophets, their desire to fulfill God's goals of justice and mercy, their view of life as sacred as we do, and certainly on their mutual respect for Jesus. As Muslims have historically seen him as the origin of the Injil, or the Gospels, they believe in his virgin birth. Do you know that today, percentage-wise, more Muslims believe in the virgin birth than Christians? One of the great paradoxes, actually. They call him the Messiah. They believe in his second coming, as we say in our creed, to judge the living and the dead, etc. As the renowned Professor Tarif Khalidi, a Muslim formerly of Cambridge University, who's now at the American University of Beirut, he wrote that wonderful book, The Muslim Jesus, says this: in Islam, there exists a preoccupation with Jesus that is unique among the world's non-Christian religions. Islamic culture presents us with what in quantity and quality are the richest images of Jesus in any non-Christian culture. No other world religion known to me has devoted so much loving attention to both the Jesus of history and the Christ of eternity. That's a Muslim writing that. Often when I give lectures in the Middle East about peace building to Muslim audiences, I actually end up choosing Jesus as kind of the role model, the teaching model for us in how to make peace with each other and keep that peace. And I can't tell you how many times, especially among the youth, they'll come up to me afterwards to shake my hand and say, "Thank you so much for highlighting Jesus." Why? Because there has been this de-emphasis of Jesus, especially throughout the Arab world, since the Crusades. Because, of course, they came in the name of Jesus. And where I grew up in Senegal, ironically, there used to be, and especially this takes place in Morocco as well, many mosques that used to be named after Jesus, but over time were increasingly named after Islamic saints because there's baggage associated with it, even though, of course, he's one of their most renowned and respected holy prophets. And I want to say a little bit here about Sufism. Sufis, of course, the mystics within Islam, are particularly sympathetic to Jesus or Isa, and they often see him as the prophet of the heart. For Sufism is known for its flexibility and its wide variety, and Sufis like, in the history of Islam, Sufis like Al-Khalaj and Zahrawardi and Rabia, and Ibn al-Arabi, Baba Tahir. Of course, everyone knows Jalaluddin Rumi so often here in the West. But they've tried to interpret Islam in fresh ways, more focusing on the concept of approach to God, more union with God. And interestingly, much of Sufism bears tremendous resemblance to Christian mysticism. For example, it was said about Ibn al-Arabi, the 13th century Sufi mystic, he is a man for this time because he has his foot in every camp, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. And then I love this quote of his, and it's done in a positive sense. The person who catches the disease of Christ cannot be cured. I like that. I think of Al-Khalaj, the 10th century Sufi martyr who loved Jesus and tried to identify with him and follow him, choosing Jesus as his model, even choosing when sentenced to death to be crucified like Christ, and he was there in Baghdad. On a contemporary level, in 1993, when I was living in Tunisia, I met someone who profoundly illustrated this to me, of following Jesus within an Islamic context. His name is Mazhar Malouhi, a celebrated Arab novelist and author. Some of the Arab League estimates that some of his novels have been read by 1.4 million Arabs. And just to give you some context, Arabs are not great readers. Naguib Mahfouz, who won the Nobel Prize in 1989, a new print run of his in his lifetime that would come out throughout the entire Arab world, about 20 countries, would only be 4,000 copies. Mazhar is originally from Syria and of Muslim background, and he's from the line of Muhammad. You can go into their house in Salamea, in the village there in Syria, and there's this wonderful genealogical tree, gold embossed, tracing their heritage back to the Prophet, and they take great pride in that. He now lives in Beirut, and his life and books have been this powerful force for peace and healing between Christians and Muslims throughout the Arab world. He's also someone who now, at the age of 85, would call himself a Muslim follower of Jesus. His own story is fascinating. As a young man, Mazhar Malouhi, his family noticed a spiritual sensitivity in him, and they put him on track to be an imam, and they sent him to a Quranic school in Syria that was actually run by the Muslim Brotherhood, which originates out of Egypt. And he found the portrayal of God in this Muslim Brotherhood school as very unfulfilling. He saw it as too transcendent, too other. He said as a young teenager, and it's actually somewhat blasphemous, but he would say this, he said it in a book I wrote, and he wanted me to really say it because that's how he thought about it at that time. He said, I would think of God or Allah up in the sky, lying down, as Arabs often do, smoking a shisha, you call it a hookah pipe here, having thrown to the world a book, meaning the Injil and the Quran, etc., and leaving humanity to suffer on its own. So he began his own spiritual quest, looking at other traditions. He looked at some of the Eastern traditions. And while he became quite a well-known young poet, serving military time on the Syrian military, he was on the Golden Heights, which at that time belonged to Syria. They don't anymore. He was given a copy of Gandhi's spiritual autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. Perhaps some of you have read that. And he was introduced in this autobiography of Gandhi's to the figure of Christ, because Gandhi talks all about Jesus through it. And so Mazhar sought out a copy of the Gospels, of the Injil, and in reading it without any link to Christians or Christianity or the church or anything like that, determines that he wants to follow in the steps of this Jesus figure. In fact, at that time, he didn't even associate that Jesus necessarily with Christianity, and Syria's population was at that time up to 10% Christian, so there were a lot of Christians around, because he was tremendously disillusioned with Christianity for two reasons. One is he saw it as a Western oppressive tool colonizing them with blind support for Israel, not a small thing for a Syrian. And secondly, he was totally unimpressed with the local Christians in his village in Salamea. His village had two Christian families. One ran the liquor house and the other ran the prostitution house. And Mazhar Malouhi's life journey has been to bridge this chasm of misunderstanding that exists between Muslims and Christians. As I mentioned, he calls himself a Muslim follower of Jesus. Today he often would say, I'm a Sufi Muslim follower of Jesus. Islam is my heritage. Christ is my inheritance, he says. In bridging his Islamic faith with the profound influence and importance of Jesus' teaching is how we should live and treat the other, is what he's all about. I remember this scene when I was interviewing him for a book, and it's the book out there called Pilgrims of Christ on the Muslim Road. I was in the Tunis, Medina, and we're drinking that thick, black, Turkish coffee. Some of you call it mud. You dare not stir it, mind you. And he's fingering his prayer beads, and he's smoking a shisha, and he's speaking to me about the sweetness of Jesus. And I remember thinking, he's touched on something I have yet to experience. And I want what he has. It was contagious, and it was overwhelming to me. Today, he's recognized and respected by Sunni Muslim authorities like the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, who would ask me for copies of his books, and I would give them to Al-Azhar, and even having relationships with senior leadership in the Shia community like Hezbollah. We talked a little bit about that at the forum. And he often goes into mosque and he teaches from the Gospels or the Injil, with many sitting around him, including imams who I've met that as a result of Mazhar Maloui have decided to become more devoted to studying and teaching about Jesus and about Isa. And Mazhar's uniqueness, actually, is that he presents to us kind of a voice from the inside, an insider's voice and perspective, as he's not only from Muslim background, but he also is captivated by this person of Jesus. And Mazhar Maloui's resulting approach to Islam has a lot, I think, to teach us as Westerners, and more specifically, those of us who call ourselves Christians here in the West, on this journey of building on what we hold in common through this Jesus figure. We can build a lot more on many other things, on their 5 pillars, for example. Fasting and pilgrimage and charity and creed and prayers. So many of the early ancient Middle Eastern Christian traditions form the special foundation for the basic practices of Islam. The Muslim form of prayer with its bowing and its prostration, where does that come from? It comes from the ancient Syrian Christian churches, and it's still practiced in pewless churches throughout the Levant today. It precedes Islam. The month-long fast of Ramadan is an Islamization of our Christian Lent. And some Middle Eastern churches actually still practice that all-day fast. The same could be said about their pilgrimage. What was one of the main reasons the Crusades took place? We couldn't get to Jerusalem. Pilgrimage was so inherent in spirituality in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period at that time. Creed. La ilaha, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's prophet. That short creed. What's the first Christian creed? Does anybody know? First Christian creed. It's close. Jesus is Lord. 3 words. This is during the time of Caesar. Jesus is Lord. It is not a creed of doctrine. It is a creed of belief. Because if Jesus is Lord as opposed to Caesar, that means the master of your life is this Jesus figure. 3 words. Then a little while later, a new creed develops slowly over the next several hundred years, which we now call the Apostles' Creed. It's 3 paragraphs, short paragraphs. It has nothing to do with how you live your life. It has only to do with doctrine or theology. And then in the early 300s, another creed develops out of the Council of Nicaea called the Nicene Creed. We said it here in church several times today. It's 3 paragraphs, but 3 times longer than the Apostles' Creed. And of course, it has nothing to do with how you live your life. Or in that sense, it has everything to do with theology and doctrine. And then another creed is developed over time. It's actually in the prayer book, the Episcopal or the Anglican prayer book. It's called the Athanasian Creed. It's not 3 paragraphs, it's 3 pages. You could never say it in a church service. There'd be no time for anything else. And then the more conservative churches in the United States have said, we don't even like those creeds. We have come with the statement of faith. Perhaps some of you come from those traditions in the past. Again, it's all about theology and belief. And the prophet here, Muhammad, is going back to the Jewish Shema. Several times throughout the day, the nature and the character of God is proclaimed to the general public. There is no God but God. In other words, who's Lord? Prayer 5 times a day. Where does that come from? Think about the Benedictine order, which precedes Islam. Morning, yeah, they have more. Morning prayer. But then in our own tradition, we have morning prayer, noon prayer, evening prayer, compline. Nobody really practices it anymore. But it comes from us. Prayer facing the holy city. Of course, originally Muhammad had them facing to Jerusalem. And then it moved to Mecca. But do you know that every single church in the entire world, pre-1950, even in the jungles of Africa, when you sat down on a cutout log, you are facing east. Symbolically, you're facing Jerusalem. We're all linked here. The architecture of the earliest minarets, square instead of round, come from the church towers in Byzantine Syria. In other words, they originated out of Christian heritage. So they might seem strange, but the strangeness is often because we don't know our own history and own tradition. And while most Western Christians don't know this, actually many of our Muslim friends don't know this as well. Certainly, if a 7th century Christian came back today, he or she would have much more in common with the worship practices of Muslims than of Western Christianity, which they wouldn't even recognize. In other words, our starting point always needs to be to discover the similarities and see the redeeming values in the other. For from this foundation, everything changes in how we see the other. In the Middle East, we hear a lot about the famous Arab hospitality and how important it is for us to in turn demonstrate that. I would like to suggest that it's even more important still to exhibit the guest posture. Not working to be a host, but focus first on wanting to be a guest. When we're a guest of someone, we've submitted to them. We've put ourselves at their disposal. We've put ourselves in a state of vulnerability and of humility. The fundamental characteristic of being a guest is that we're willing to receive actually from the host. I love that story of Jesus and Zacchaeus that we learned maybe in church school. If you grew up in church school, you know, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Every imaginable, if you look at that story, every imaginable barrier is up keeping Jesus and Zacchaeus from seeing each other. Social, cultural, economic, religious, physical even. He was a tiny man. And what does Jesus say? Zacchaeus, may I come to your house to eat? Zacchaeus, can I be your guest? It is a posture that breaks down the barriers. Rumi said, this being human is a guest house. And I'm reminded of that beautiful statement related to all of this, written by St. Ambrose of Milan, who baptized St. Augustine, who was a Berber North African from Hippo. St. Ambrose said, all truth, no matter where it comes from God's Spirit. And the challenge for us is to always build on the truth in the other. Thirdly, this leads to the pillar of fasting, Saum. During the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, from sunrise to sunset, some of you have experienced Ramadan in a Muslim majority context, and it's this beautiful time of contemplation and of celebration and of charity. And of course, the idea of fasting, when you think about it, is about withholding something, letting go, a giving up. And I would propose that now more than ever that both Christians and Muslims need to let go of this concept, albeit somewhat subconscious, of the Christian faith being primarily an Western-oriented faith and Islam being a Middle Eastern one. Both are Middle Eastern at origin, as is, of course, Judaism. And when it's forgotten, we as Christians especially forget this. We lose our true sense of identity of who we are and where we came from. Christianity began as a Middle Eastern faith. It's only due to the accidents of history that the center of gravity of Christianity moved to the West. And Christianity has really suffered from this ailment actually much more than Islam, actually. For example, most Muslims around the world today are not Arab and don't even speak Arabic, whether it be from Senegal in West Africa, where I grew up, all the way to Indonesia and Southeast Asia. However, all Muslims see their faith as very much Middle Eastern in origin. And of course, the fact that the Quran can only be recited in Arabic very much helps reinforce this. Regardless of where they are around the world, the Middle East is still their first point of cultural reference when it comes to their faith. In contrast, while also the majority of Christians are not Middle Eastern, whether it be in the West or whether it be in South Asia or Latin America or Africa or Korea or China for that matter, we have forgotten our Middle Easternness in origin, or at least we don't emphasize it enough and give it its due respect. And it's critical for us, I think, to recognize and emphasize the Middle Eastern nature of our faith and origin of both faiths, actually, as we relate to each other, because we both come from the same place. And more specifically, just as the stream takes on the coloring of the soil over which it flows, so Christianity, in flowing through the soils of different ethnic and national and cultural outlooks, took on a lot of coloring from them. Hence, a good deal has been added to the teachings of Jesus. And as a result, in regard to Jesus today, many people, Christian and Muslim, perceive him as a Westerner with not much connection to Middle Eastern culture, and yet he was a full-blooded Middle Easterner. And for Christians, the challenge is to effectively strip this Jesus of the Western trappings and see him again as one who was born and lived and died in the Middle East, returning him to his cultural origins, a Jesus who first walked the Middle Eastern road. And in this sense, it's actually Jesus, the Middle Easterner, that we as Christians follow, and we always need to remember that we will always be cultural outsiders to this figure. I remember a young Omani Muslim man telling me that when he read a publication by Mazhar Maloui titled An Eastern Reading, a Middle Eastern reading of the Gospel, or the Injil of Luke, which is one of the best-selling books in Oman right now. He said to me, it was the first time he'd ever read it, and he said, it's like a letter written from home. In other words, it's from their culture. And this challenges Western Christians, I think, to assess even on an ongoing basis, as followers of Jesus, of the Gospels, are we following that Jesus, or are we following the Jesus of a specific Western religion that's grown up around him over the centuries? If anything's true about our own faith, it's true because of this Jesus figure, not because of Christianity. Certainly something Jesus was not part of. After all, Jesus, of course, wasn't a Christian. I love that powerful short story of Khalil Gibran, the early 20th century Lebanese poet, artist, and mystic from Christian background, from the Maronite Catholic Church, who so beautifully bridged East and West. He said this, once every 100 years, Jesus of Nazareth meets Jesus of the Christian in a garden among the hills of Lebanon, and they talk long. And each time, Jesus of Nazareth goes away saying to Jesus of the Christian, my friend, I fear we shall never, never agree. It also relates to our sacred scriptures. Interestingly, many Muslims see the Christian Bible as Western, or at least as foreign. It smells foreign, even when it's in Arabic. It smells of the West, how it's presented, how it's published, how it's packaged. And of course, Westerners think of the Quran as an ancient Middle Eastern book, the religious book of our Muslim brothers and sisters, and yet the Christian and Jewish scriptures, when you think about what we call the Bible, is really simply a collection of ancient Middle Eastern books put into one volume for our benefit to carry around. And it's far more complex in its Middle Easternness than the Holy Quran. Written in 3 Middle Eastern languages, not one, from a vast expanse of Middle Eastern cultures, using various Middle Eastern literary genres, and culturally steeped in all parts of the ancient Middle East. We all come from the same place. Thirdly, the pillar of prayer, Salah, praying 5 times a day facing Mecca. And prayer, regardless of the tradition, when you think about it, is ultimately about putting ourselves in a certain disposition toward God. It's a specific attitude. It's of aligning ourselves to God's intention of how we should live, what Christ called living the kingdom of God. And when those Western Christians came to Gandhi and they asked him about best to live and communicate their Christ to Indians, after telling them first, well, try living like Christ, the second thing he said was this: I would suggest that you must practice your religion without adulterating it or toning it down. What did he mean? To Gandhi, in essence, this meant fully embodying Christ's Sermon on the Mount, which Gandhi said went straight to his heart when he first read it, and formed much of the basis of his life and teachings and practice. And that entails a sacrificial approach, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, one of kindness, one of selflessness, one of forgiveness. Ultimately, it's about Jesus' second great commandment, loving our neighbor as ourselves. In the Middle East, this also means hospitality. For as there's that wonderful Arab proverb that goes, the guest is a guest of God. And one of the best ways to love or to be hospitable is actually by honoring them and their culture, which leads to this idea of integrity. For honesty and integrity need to be the pillars upon which we build our relationships with our Muslim brothers and sisters on. And that mandates total authenticity, having no hidden agenda whatsoever in our relationships with them. There's this wonderful Arab proverb that says, you can't carry 2 watermelons in one hand. In other words, our relationships must be fully authentic ones, not with any hidden agenda of changing the other. On the individual level, Mazhar Maloui has observed that followers of Jesus and his way within Islam have actually often traditionally been encouraged by Christians to kind of leave or break away from their Muslim communities. His own Syrian Christian friends whom he finally met encouraged him to actually leave his Islamic culture and become Christian. They encouraged him to take a Christian name, Mazhar Maloui. It's a Muslim name. Stop praying as he did. Don't use your body as you pray. They said Muslims do that. To cease fastings, to start using Christian Arabic terminology. Don't say salamu alaikum, say salam lakum. Means the same thing, but Christians say it one way, Muslims another. To stop attending his family's religious celebrations, to keep his distance from mosque, and to really prove that he crossed over the line, they challenged him to eat pork in public. But he, of course, came to realize that following Jesus' teaching doesn't mean joining another religion. It doesn't require taking a Christian name or using the symbol of the cross, something even the early church was embarrassed to use, or changing the day of public worship, or adhering to a different style of worship within a church building, or eating different foods, or drinking alcohol, or using images of Jesus. Of course, our Muslim friends do not use images of those they consider holy prophets out of respect. And ceasing to fast doesn't require any of that. And Mazhar loves to tell a parable to those Christians who feel that Muslims who desire to follow Jesus should leave their Islamic culture and practices. And it goes like this. And if he was here today, he would just be espousing proverbs and parables. And this one's of a monkey swinging from the tree. And the monkey this tree is over a large body of water, and the monkey looks down and he sees all the fish swimming. And he reaches down and he catches them and he picks them up one by one and he begins to hang them on the tree. And someone comes by and they see the monkey doing this and they say, "What in the world are you doing?" And the monkey, with all good intentions and great enthusiasm, mind you, responded, "Well, I looked down and I saw the fish drowning and I'm saving them." But little did he know that he was killing them, and quickly. Openness and honesty and honoring the other are always and only the ways of God. The pillar of charity, number 5, zakat, 2.5% of someone's total savings. I'm not talking here really about financial charity in this. I'm really talking about the idea of demonstrating charity. And this relates to showing our love for each other by loving what the other loves. Westerners often think that they really can't get very far without Arabic. It's always a big problem. Actually, one of the main questions I get often in giving talks is, "I don't speak Arabic." Well, Mazhar Maloui would say, yes, learning Arabic, if you're going to live there a long time, is helpful. But language is always second. Loving them is first. And they sense it just like that. Gandhi, when those Western Christians came to him, he said, thirdly, I would suggest that you put your emphasis on love, for love is the center and the soul of Christ. And one of the key ways to show this is by loving what our Muslim brothers and sisters love, love what they hold dear, which is their rich culture, such as their literature. Read Naguib Mahfouz. Read Amin Malouf. Read Adonis, this wonderful contemporary Syrian poet. Read Abdurrahman Munif. Read Taha Hussein. Read Yaha Haki. Read Tawfiq Al-Hakim. They're all available now on Amazon in English for you, or Barnes & Noble down the street somewhere. Islamic culture has cherished storytelling for centuries, having this long, rich literary history. And in regard to faith, stories are especially powerful in the Eastern tradition, and therefore culturally they are one of the most effective mediums through which to address issues of peace and harmony and respect and faith. I mean, Jesus, after all, the Middle Easterner, was the master of the short story. In other words, always focus on minimizing the differences. And I encourage Westerners to love their dance, to love their music, to love their food. You can do that here. To love, even if you're not a smoker and you happen to go over there, love their shisha, their hookah pipe. We have to get past this who does what and who doesn't do what. Building bridges. And it means cultivating this profound sensitivity, seeing life through their eyes. Loving their understanding of community. Their individual within an Arab and in most Islamic cultures is important only as he or she belongs to the community, the ummah. There's this wonderful Arab proverb that says, "Don't tell me who you are. Tell me who your friends are." Love their films. Everyone here, the entire St. Matthew's, should be mandated to watch two films. One is Hassan and Marcos. It's one of Omar Sharif's last films that he filmed. And it's an incredible film about interfaith, okay? And he actually portrays a priest and an imam in the film, and it's a comedy. And the second one I would encourage everyone to watch is titled Where Do We Go Now? It's by the wonderful Lebanese director Nadine Labaki. It takes place in Lebanon. It won the People's Favorite Award at the Toronto International Film Festival a few years back. You can get them all on Amazon Prime or Netflix or whatever. Profound. Love and understand their visual art, understanding their modern and contemporary art, because it speaks to where they are and what they're going through today. I work for an organization that was mentioned that's affiliated with the Episcopal Church that uses the arts to bridge between the Middle East and West, and especially their creeds. Because we have found the arts actually to be one of the most effective ways to build respect and to facilitate understanding and to encourage friendship between the two. As Khalil Gibran said, the author of The Prophet, we have forgotten, or have we, that there's but one universal language, and that its voice is art. And then he went on to say, your neighbor is your other self, dwelling behind a wall, and understanding all walls fall down. But the arts can very much help put ourselves in the other's shoes, and they help us cultivate this profound sensitivity, trying to see with the other's eyes. And time again, we have seen the words of the 14th century Persian Sufi poet and mystic Hafez to be true. Art is the conversation. Art offers an opening for the heart. Art is at least this knowledge of where we are all standing in this wonderland. We are partners straddling the universe. So the arts, our experience has been that they actually become encounter points, encouraging new friendships across religions and cultures, bringing people together that wouldn't normally ever come together. And I have to tell you, I am personally passionate about much more than interfaith dialogue, which is very in vogue right now and has been for a number of years. But I am really passionate, much more so, about interfaith friendships. And they are much more difficult to come about because they involve the investment of yourself in the other. But they make all the difference. And loving what the other loves minimizes the differences and builds bridges. Mazhar Maloui says, and you think about going to the Middle East, this was very apropos. The light we see from the stars at night comes from stars that are far away. These stars may no longer be in existence, but their light still shines on us. Even so, the memory of Western Christians lives on with Muslims they knew and loved, even if they are no longer there in person. Sixth, the final for tonight, is the pillar of pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca, required by all Muslims, given they have the financial capacity to do so at least once in their lifetime. And it's deeply moving to hear from someone who's just returned from the Hajj how spiritually inspiring it was to them. And for a Muslim, having made the pilgrimage, instead of viewing themselves as actually ticking off the list, oh, the fifth pillar, I've done it. Instead, they see that as the beginning of the most intense phase of their pilgrimage toward God. And they come back with the title, El Hajj Yusuf, El Hajj Ahmed, El Hajj Mustafa, Hadiji Nedra, Pilgrim Paul, Pilgrim Neville, Pilgrim Susan. It's a beautiful concept. And I think it's critical that when Christians and Muslims relate to each other, that they primarily see themselves both as pilgrims, journeying in life and toward God, and not having arrived. So much of our faith teaches us that one arrives. Certainly that creedal emphasis of our faith breeds a sense of finality to it, kind of puts a box around it with borders on it. But I think it's much more accurate to say that we are a people of pilgrimage. And a pilgrim is someone, of course, always on the move, always journeying, and therefore more open to asking others for instructions or directions and meeting new people, even Christians asking Muslims for help on our journey of trying to live the life God desires for us to live. Mazhar Malawi, when he goes into a new community, he goes to the senior imam and he gives him a copy of the Injil of Luke, the Middle Eastern reading of the Gospel of Luke. And he said, I'd encourage you please to read this, because if you see anything in my life while I'm living in this community that contradicts the teachings of Isa or of Jesus, you call me on it. Help me become a better person. It's a certain attitude, a spirit of openness, of gentleness, of willingness to grow in our faith, regardless of where it comes from. When we lived in Carthage and Tunisia, I fell in love with the mosaics of early antiquity. And I often see all of this like this beautiful divine mosaic, if you will, with each little chip, each little piece being a different cultural expression of faith. And when they're all together, all those pieces are in place, the whole portraying the beauty of God's character and nature as nothing else can. And it's in the continual learning from these many different faith and spiritual expressions that our own faith actually can be made most complete. There's a poem in the book of the Psalms, or the Zabur, as our Muslim friends would say, known as the Pilgrim Psalm, Psalm 84. Both Christians and Muslims love this psalm. And right in the middle it says, "Blessed are those who have set their hearts on pilgrimage." And I've got to tell you, in this sense, all of this has been and continues to be a pilgrimage for me toward seeing God with new eyes, and certainly providing a freshness on my spiritual journey that I never knew or even imagined possible. Now, I could talk for another 2 or 3 hours, but I'm going to stop. Thank you.